The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Adelaide Cottage as Catherine sat by the window, her tea growing cold in her hands. The diagnosis had come 3 months ago, delivered in the sterile confines of a private clinic where even the walls seemed to whisper secrets. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The words had hung in the air like a death sentence, and despite all the royal protocols and public duties, nothing could prepare a person for such news. William had been in the middle of a charity event when the call came. His private secretary had approached him discreetly, whispering that Catherine needed him urgently. The drive back to their home felt like the longest journey of his life. Every traffic light, every turn seemed to mock him with its normalcy, while his world was falling apart. When he arrived, Catherine was sitting in their garden, staring at the roses they had planted together the previous spring. She didn't need to say anything. He could see it in her eyes, in the way her shoulders had curved inward as if protecting herself from an invisible blow. They held each other for what felt like hours. Two people who had weathered public scrutiny, family tragedies and the weight of royal duty, now facing their most private and devastating battle. The children were at school, blissfully unaware that their mother's laughter might soon become just a memory. George, with his father's serious eyes and gentle nature, Charlotte with her spirited independence, and little Louis with his infectious giggles that could light up any room. How do you tell children that the person who kisses their scraped knees and reads them bedtime stories might not be there to see them grow up? Catherine had always been the steady one in their relationship. While William sometimes struggled with the burden of his future role as king, she had adapted to royal life with grace and determination. She had transformed from a middle-class girl from Berkshire into one of the most beloved members of the royal family. Her warmth had won over the British public, and her dedication to causes like mental health and early childhood development had earned her respect worldwide. But now, sitting in their private sanctuary, she felt anything but steady. The woman who had faced down tabloid photographers and navigated complex royal protocols was terrified, not of death itself, but of leaving behind the 3 small people who called her mummy, and the man who had been her anchor for over 2 decades. The doctor had been honest about the prognosis. With aggressive treatment, she might have 18 months, perhaps 2 years if they were fortunate. Without treatment, considerably less. They had discussed every option, every experimental therapy, every possible path forward, but Catherine had made her decision with the same quiet determination that had defined her entire adult life. She would fight, but she would do it on her terms. No dramatic announcements, no public battle played out in the media. She would continue her royal duties for as long as possible, creating memories with her children, and when the time came, she would face the end with the same dignity that had characterized her life. William struggled with her decision initially. His instinct was to protect her, to wrap her in the best medical care money could buy, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But he had learned, over their years together, to trust Catherine's wisdom. She had an innate understanding of what mattered most, a clarity that cut through the noise of royal expectations and public pressure. The next few weeks were a careful balance of normalcy and preparation. They told the children together, sitting in the nursery where they had once read fairy tales about happy endings. George at 11 understood more than his younger siblings. His questions were thoughtful and heartbreaking. Charlotte, 9 years old and fiercely protective of those she loved, declared that she would take care of everyone. Louis, still so young at 6, simply climbed into his mother's lap and asked if this meant she wouldn't be able to play football with him anymore. Catherine promised them that she would always be with them, even when they couldn't see her. She began writing letters for future birthdays, graduations, weddings, and other milestones she might miss. Each letter was a piece of her heart, carefully crafted words that would have to carry her love forward through time. The royal household was informed on a need-to-know basis. The Queen, despite her own advancing age, became a pillar of strength for the family. She had faced loss before, had buried her husband, and weathered countless storms. Her experience became a source of comfort for William, who found himself struggling to maintain his composure during official functions. Catherine continued her royal engagements with remarkable grace. She visited hospitals, attended charity galas, and carried out her duties with the same warmth and dedication that had always defined her public persona. Those close to her marveled at her strength, but William could see the toll it was taking. The subtle changes that others missed, The way she held onto railings a little longer. The careful way she moved when she thought no one was watching. As autumn approached, Catherine made the decision to scale back her public appearances. The official reason given was a desire to spend more time with the children during the school term. The truth was that the treatments were becoming harder to hide, and she wanted to preserve her energy for what mattered most. The cottage became their refuge, a place where they could simply be a family without the weight of royal protocol. They cooked together, played board games, and took long walks through the countryside. Catherine taught Charlotte how to bake her grandmother's apple tart recipe, spending patient hours in the kitchen creating memories that would outlast any crown or title. William found himself memorizing everything. The way Catherine hummed while she worked in the garden, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the sound of her laugh when one of the children said something particularly clever. He was storing up these moments like precious gems, knowing that soon they would be all he had left of the woman who had changed his life completely. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the countryside in a pristine white that made everything look peaceful and still. Catherine had always loved winter, the way it transformed the landscape into something magical and serene. Now, as she watched the snow fall from her bedroom window, she felt a strange comfort in its quiet beauty. The treatments had become more difficult, leaving her exhausted and frail. Her once vibrant auburn hair had begun to thin, though she wore scarves and hats with such elegance that many people simply thought she was embracing a new fashion trend. William would catch her looking in mirrors sometimes, touching her reflection with fingertips that seemed to be memorizing her own face. The children had adapted with the remarkable resilience that children possess. They had created new traditions around Catherine's illness without ever acknowledging that's what they were doing. George would bring her tea every morning before school, carefully carrying the tray with the solemnity of a royal page. Charlotte had taken over reading bedtime stories to Louis, her young voice imitating the different character voices that Catherine had perfected over the years. Louis, sensing that his mother needed extra gentleness, had stopped his usual boisterous play around her, instead becoming her shadow, quietly offering drawings and small treasures he found in the garden. Catherine's parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, had become frequent visitors to the cottage. The grandparents, who had once been careful to maintain appropriate boundaries with their royal daughter, now spent entire days simply being present. Carol would sit for hours with Catherine, sometimes talking, sometimes just sharing comfortable silence. Michael, usually a man of few words, found himself telling stories of Catherine's childhood, painting pictures of a fearless little girl who climbed trees and scraped knees and never met a challenge she wouldn't face head-on. The medical team that visited the cottage had become like extended family. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Catherine's primary oncologist, was a woman in her 50s who had dedicated her life to fighting cancer. She had seen many patients face terminal diagnoses, but Catherine's grace in the face of such devastating news had moved her profoundly. During their consultations, Catherine would ask more questions about Dr. Mitchell's other patients than about her own condition, genuinely concerned about strangers she would never meet. William had requested a leave of absence from his official duties, though he phrased it as a sabbatical to focus on family time. The palace had readily agreed, understanding the gravity of the situation even if the public remained unaware. His days had taken on a new rhythm, one dictated not by royal schedules, but by Catherine's needs and the family's desire to make every moment count. He had become an expert at reading the subtle signs of her pain, knowing when she needed medication even before she asked for it. He learned to cook her favorite meals, though his culinary skills were limited, and often resulted in burned toast and oversalted soup. Catherine would eat every bite, praising his efforts with the same enthusiasm she had once reserved for state dinners prepared by world-class chefs. The couple had begun working on what they privately called the project. It was a comprehensive collection of videos, letters, and recordings that Catherine was creating for her children. She recorded herself reading their favorite bedtime stories, complete with all the voices and sound effects they loved. She made videos for future birthdays, offering motherly advice for challenges she wouldn't be there to help them navigate. There were recordings about first loves, career choices, and the importance of kindness over perfection. William participated in these recordings too, though he often had to stop and compose himself. Catherine's strength in these moments was remarkable. She spoke to her future grandchildren, people she would never meet but loved already. She recorded marriage advice for her children, relationship wisdom gained from nearly 15 years of marriage to their father. Most importantly, she told them repeatedly how proud she was of them, how much joy they had brought to her life, and how they should never feel guilty for being happy after she was gone. The palace had begun making quiet preparations for what everyone knew was inevitable. Plans were discussed in hushed tones, arrangements made with the discretion that royal protocol demanded. But Catherine had made it clear that she wanted her funeral to be a celebration of life, not a somber affair. She wanted bright flowers, uplifting music, and for people to remember her laugh rather than mourn her passing. Christmas that year was unlike any they had celebrated before. Catherine had insisted on maintaining all their family traditions, but everything felt more precious, more intentional. She watched her children open their presents with an intensity that seemed to burn every detail into her memory. William found her crying quietly during the Christmas morning chaos, and when he asked what was wrong, she simply said she was overwhelmed by how perfect the moment was. The children had picked up on the weight of the season, though they couldn't have articulated why everything felt so significant. They lingered longer at the breakfast table, sat closer together during movie nights, and seemed reluctant to go to bed, as if they didn't want to waste any time sleeping. Catherine's brother James and sister Pippa visited frequently, bringing a lightness that the cottage desperately needed. James, who had struggled with depression in recent years, found purpose in making his sister laugh during her darkest moments. Pippa, now a mother herself, understood in a way she couldn't have before the magnitude of what Catherine was facing. The three siblings would sit together like they had as children, sharing inside jokes and memories that predated royal titles and public scrutiny. As winter deepened, Catherine's mobility became more limited. William had arranged for a hospital bed to be set up in their bedroom, though Catherine insisted it be positioned so she could still see their garden through the window. She spent hours watching the birds at the feeder they had installed, finding peace in the simple rhythm of nature, continuing its cycle despite human suffering. The local village had begun to sense that something was different about the royal family's presence. They noticed that the cottage was occupied more frequently, that there were more medical vehicles making discreet visits, that the prince seemed to be around much more than usual. But the community, with typical British reserve and genuine affection for the family, maintained a respectful distance while finding small ways to show their support. Fresh flowers appeared at the cottage gate. Homemade preserves were left with handwritten notes, and the local church began including special prayers for the family's well-being. Dr. Mitchell had gently suggested that spring might be optimistic timing. Catherine received this news with the same calm acceptance she had shown throughout her illness. She asked for time estimates not out of fear, but because she wanted to plan appropriately. There were still things she needed to do, conversations she needed to have, and memories she needed to create. Spring arrived with an almost cruel beauty that year. The garden that Catherine loved so dearly burst into bloom, with an abundance that seemed to mock the fading of her own life. Daffodils pushed through the soil she could no longer tend, and the apple trees she had planted with such hope displayed their blossoms like nature's own celebration of renewal. Catherine watched from her window with a bittersweet appreciation for the irony. Her condition had deteriorated more rapidly than anyone had hoped. The woman who had once walked marathons for charity now struggled to make it from her bed to the sitting room. But her spirit remained unbroken, even as her body betrayed her. She had developed an almost ethereal quality, as if she were already beginning to exist somewhere between this world and the next. The children had been told that their mother's time was running short. The conversation had taken place in the sitting room, where they had shared so many happy moments, with William and Catherine sitting together on the sofa they had chosen when they first moved to the cottage. George, now 12 and wise beyond his years, had asked the practical questions that showed he was already thinking about how to protect his younger siblings. Charlotte had announced with fierce determination that she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Louis had simply climbed into Catherine's lap and stayed there for the rest of the conversation. Catherine had asked each child individually what they would want to remember about her. George had said her bedtime stories and the way she never got angry when he tracked mud through the house. Charlotte had mentioned their baking sessions and how Catherine always let her lick the spoon. Louis had said her hugs felt like sunshine. These conversations became precious gifts that Catherine treasured. knowing they would also become treasured memories for her children. The palace had begun to make more concrete arrangements. Though everything was handled with extraordinary discretion, the Queen had visited personally, a rare private visit that spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. The elderly monarch had sat beside Catherine's bed, two women who had devoted their lives to service, sharing an understanding that transcended their different generations and circumstances. Catherine's medical team had introduced stronger pain medications, though she resisted them during the day when the children were awake. She wanted to be present and alert for every possible moment with them. The nights, however, had become difficult. William would often find her awake at 3 a.m, staring out at the garden, lost in thoughts she rarely shared. She had begun giving away her personal possessions, not in a morbid way, but as gifts with stories attached. Her favorite necklace went to Charlotte, with instructions that it should be worn on her wedding day. Her collection of books went to George, each one annotated with notes about why she had loved particular passages. Her paintings and sketches were distributed among family members and close friends, each accompanied by a letter explaining the memory or emotion behind the artwork. William had become fiercely protective of their privacy during these final weeks. He had asked the palace to refuse all requests for public appearances, and had made it clear that the family was not to be disturbed except for genuine emergencies. The protection officers who guarded their cottage had become like silent guardians of grief, understanding that their job now was to protect not just physical safety, but emotional sanctuary. Catherine's appetite had virtually disappeared. Though she made efforts to join the family for meals when possible, she would sit at the table and push food around her plate while encouraging the children to eat, asking about their school days and maintaining the normal rhythms of family life, even as everything was fundamentally abnormal. These dinners became exercises in collective strength, each family member working to maintain normalcy for the others. The cottage had taken on an almost sacred quality. Visitors spoke in hushed tones, moved more carefully, seemed to understand instinctively that they were in the presence of something profound. Catherine's parents had essentially moved in, taking over the practical aspects of running the household while William focused entirely on his wife and children. Carol Middleton, who had always been the strong organizational force in her family, now found herself managing the logistics of dying with the same efficiency she had once brought to planning parties. Catherine had requested one final royal engagement, though she hadn't told anyone what she had in mind. She asked William to arrange for a photographer to come to the cottage, not for public release but for private family portraits. She wanted images of all of them together, while she could still sit up and smile. The photographer, a trusted professional who had captured many royal moments over the years, worked with unusual sensitivity, understanding that these would be the last formal photographs of the complete family. The children had begun sleeping in their parents' room, mattresses arranged on the floor around the hospital bed like a protective barrier of love. William would often wake to find all 3 children somehow squeezed onto Catherine's narrow bed, careful not to disturb her medical equipment, but desperate to be close to her. These moments of innocent devotion were simultaneously heartbreaking and beautiful. Catherine's breathing had become more labored, requiring oxygen support during parts of the day. She joked weakly that she finally understood why William had always been fascinated by aviation, since she now felt like she was wearing a pilot's mask, but the humor felt forced, and everyone could see that even speaking had become an effort. Dr. Mitchell had gently suggested that it might be time to contact extended family and close friends who wanted to say goodbye. Catherine had compiled a list, though she insisted that visits be brief and upbeat. She didn't want her final conversations with people to be sad affairs. She wanted to thank them, to share one last laugh, to leave them with something positive to remember. Her closest friends from university days came to visit, women who had known her long before she became a princess. They brought photo albums from their shared past, reminding Catherine of the carefree young woman she had been. These visits seemed to energize her in a way that medical interventions no longer could, as if reconnecting with her younger self provided a kind of spiritual strength. The local rector had begun making regular visits, though Catherine's relationship with Faith had always been more private than public. Their conversations remained confidential, but William noticed that these meetings seemed to bring her peace. She had always been someone who found comfort in quiet contemplation, and now that inner serenity seemed to radiate outward, touching everyone around her. As April progressed, it became clear that time was running shorter than anyone had hoped. Catherine had begun sleeping more during the day, and her periods of alertness were becoming briefer but more intense, as if she were concentrating all her remaining energy into moments of connection with her family. The cottage filled with an anticipatory silence, everyone waiting while trying to pretend they weren't waiting. The final week of April brought an unexpected warmth to the countryside, as if nature itself was offering one last gift. Catherine had rallied slightly, finding enough strength to sit in the garden wheelchair for short periods. Feeling the sun on her face and breathing in the scent of the blooming lavender she had planted 3 years earlier, these moments became precious beyond measure, stolen time that everyone knew was borrowed against an inevitable deadline. William had taken to sleeping in the chair beside her bed, unwilling to miss any moment of consciousness she might have. He would wake at the slightest change in her breathing, instantly alert to any need she might have. The man who had once commanded military, helicopters, and would someday command a nation had reduced his world to the sound of his wife's breathing and the rhythm of her heartbeat on the medical monitors. Catherine had begun having conversations with people who weren't there. Sometimes she would speak to her grandfather, who had died when she was 15. Other times she seemed to be talking to William's mother, Diana, describing the children and assuring her that they were being raised with love and kindness. These moments initially alarmed the family, but Dr. Mitchell explained that such experiences were normal and often brought comfort to patients in their final days. The children had developed their own rituals around their mother's condition. George would read to her from the newspapers each morning, carefully selecting positive stories about charity work and community achievements, avoiding anything that might upset her. Charlotte had taken over completely as Louis's protector, helping him understand what was happening in terms his 6-year-old mind could process. She had developed a remarkable maturity, becoming a bridge between the adult world of medical realities and the childhood world of hope and confusion. Louis had begun leaving small drawings and crafts on Catherine's bedside table each day. Stick figure families with everyone smiling, flowers drawn in bright crayons, and paper airplanes that he would carefully fold and place where she could see them when she woke up. His innocent attempts to make his mother's environment more cheerful became a source of both joy and heartbreak for the adults around him. Catherine's final royal duty came unexpectedly. The Queen had requested a private video call, wanting to speak with Catherine one last time about the children's futures and the continuity of the monarchy. It was an extraordinary conversation between two women who understood the weight of duty and sacrifice. Catherine, though barely able to sit up, spoke with clarity about her hopes for her children's upbringing and her faith in William's ability to lead them, and eventually, the nation. The palace had begun preparing public statements, though the decision had been made to maintain privacy until after Catherine's death. The British public had no idea that their beloved princess was dying, though there had been speculation about her reduced public appearances. The official story remained that she was taking time for family, and that fiction would be maintained until the very end. Catherine's sister Pippa had moved into the cottage temporarily, bringing her own young children to provide some normalcy and distraction. The sound of children playing, even quietly, seemed to comfort Catherine in ways that adult conversation could not. She would listen to the gentle chaos of family life continuing around her, finding peace in the knowledge that life would go on, that love would persist even after her death. Her brother James had become an unexpected source of strength for William. The two men, so different in background and temperament, had found common ground in their shared love for Catherine and their determination to support her through these final days. James's struggles with mental health had given him an understanding of darkness that proved helpful in navigating this ultimate darkness. Catherine had asked William to promise her several things as her condition continued to deteriorate. She wanted him to remarry eventually, to find companionship and love again. Though he couldn't imagine such a possibility in his grief, she wanted the children to remember her, but not be defined by their loss. Most importantly, she wanted him to find joy again, to laugh with their children, to live fully rather than merely existing in her memory. The nights had become the most difficult time. Catherine would often wake confused and distressed, calling out for people or reaching for things that weren't there. William learned to calm her with gentle touches and quiet words, sometimes singing the lullabies she had once sung to their children. These midnight vigils became a kind of sacred duty, protecting her from fear even as she slipped away from him. Dr. Mitchell had explained that Catherine's hearing would likely be the last sense to fade, encouraging the family to continue talking to her, even when she seemed unconscious. They filled her room with stories, memories, expressions of love, and plans for the future. William told her about the garden renovations he planned to make in her memory, about the scholarship foundation they would establish in her name, about how he would teach their children to remember her strength rather than her suffering. The cottage's atmosphere had shifted from anticipation to vigil. Conversations happened in whispers, movements became more deliberate, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath. The protection officers maintained their posts with unusual reverence, understanding that they were guarding something more precious than physical safety. They were protecting a family's final moments together. Catherine's breathing had become irregular, requiring constant oxygen support. Her periods of consciousness were brief but intense, filled with urgent whispers of love and final instructions. She would grasp William's hand with surprising strength during these moments, her eyes searching his face as if memorizing it for a journey she would have to make alone. The children had been told that their mother would likely die within the next few days. The conversation had been handled with extraordinary care, emphasizing that death was not abandonment, that love continues even when physical presence ends. George had asked if she would still be able to watch over them somehow. Charlotte wanted to know if it would hurt. Louis simply asked if she would still love them from heaven. Their questions broke hearts while demonstrating the profound trust they had in their parents to guide them through even this ultimate crisis. On the last day of April, Catherine had what Dr. Mitchell called a rally, a brief return of alertness that sometimes occurs before the end. She was able to hold proper conversations with each of her children individually, to tell William once more how much their life together had meant to her, and to express gratitude for the extraordinary privilege of being their mother and his wife. These final lucid hours became a gift that none of them had dared to hope for, a chance to say everything that needed to be said before it was too late. The morning of May 2nd dawned with the kind of perfect spring beauty that seemed almost offensive given the gravity of what was unfolding inside Adelaide Cottage. The apple trees were in full bloom, their white and pink petals drifting on the gentle breeze like nature's own confetti. Catherine had always said that early May was her favorite time of year, when everything felt possible and new. The irony was not lost on anyone. Catherine had spent the night in and out of consciousness, her breathing becoming increasingly labored despite the oxygen support. William had not left her side, holding her hand and speaking to her in the soft, intimate tones they had shared throughout their marriage. The children had been allowed brief visits throughout the night, each saying their own private goodbyes in the innocent, heartbreaking way that only children can manage. Dr. Mitchell had arrived early that morning, taking one look at Catherine's condition and gently informing the family that today would likely be the day. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming an ordinary Tuesday into the last day of Catherine's life. Everyone moved with a careful deliberateness, as if sudden movements might somehow accelerate the inevitable. The children had been kept busy with quiet activities in the sitting room, their grandmother Carol reading to them while maintaining the pretense of normalcy. But even Louis, despite his young age, seemed to understand that something momentous was happening. They spoke in whispers and moved like shadows, their usual childhood energy muted by an instinctive understanding of the gravity surrounding them. Catherine's parents had positioned themselves where they could be close but not intrusive. Michael Middleton, the man who had walked his daughter down the aisle at Westminster Abbey in front of 2 billion people, now sat quietly in the corner of her bedroom, his presence a steady comfort in her final hours. Carol moved between the children and her daughter, somehow managing to be exactly where she was needed most at any given moment. The palace had been informed that the end was near, though no official announcements would be made until after Catherine's death. The Queen had requested to be notified immediately, understanding that this loss would affect not just a family but a nation. Preparations that had been discussed in theoretical terms for months were now being put into motion with the efficiency that only the royal household could manage. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine's breathing became more peaceful, the struggle of the past weeks giving way to a quieter rhythm. William found himself matching his own breathing to hers, as if he could somehow accompany her partway on the journey she was taking. He told her about their first meeting at university, about their wedding day, about the first time he had seen her hold each of their children. He painted pictures with words of their life together, creating a narrative of love that would carry them both through these final hours. The room had taken on an almost sacred quality. Sunlight streamed through the windows that Catherine had insisted remain uncovered, casting gentle patterns on the walls. The monitors that had tracked her vital signs for weeks now seemed less important than the simple human act of being present with someone who was dying. Love had become more powerful than medicine, presence more healing than any treatment. Catherine's sister Pippa had brought fresh flowers from the garden, filling the room with the scent of the roses Catherine loved so much. These simple touches transformed the medical environment into something that felt more like home, more like the peaceful ending that Catherine had hoped for. Every detail had been considered with love, creating an atmosphere of beauty even in the face of profound loss. William had been reading aloud from their favorite poetry, the words of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and William Wordsworth, filling the quiet spaces between Catherine's breaths. Literature had always been a shared passion, and now these beautiful words served as a bridge between the life they had known and whatever came after. The poetry seemed to comfort not just Catherine, but everyone in the room, providing a framework of beauty for an experience that felt too large for ordinary language. The children had been brought in for one final visit as the sun began to set. They climbed carefully onto the bed, surrounding their mother with their small bodies in a protective circle of love. Catherine's eyes fluttered open one last time, and she looked at each of their faces with an intensity that seemed to capture their images permanently in her heart. She whispered words of love that were barely audible but felt deeply in every heart present. George, mature beyond his years, told his mother that he would take care of Charlotte and Louis. Charlotte promised to always remember their baking sessions and to teach Louis everything she knew. Louis, not fully understanding but sensing the solemnity of the moment, simply kissed his mother's forehead and told her he loved her more than all the stars in the sky. These final exchanges between mother and children carried a weight that would sustain the children through years of grief and healing. As evening approached, Catherine's breathing became even more peaceful. The struggle was ending, replaced by a kind of serene surrender that seemed to transform her face into something ethereal and beautiful. William could see in her expression the young woman he had fallen in love with 20 years earlier, as if the illness had been stripped away to reveal the essential Catherine beneath. The local rector had arrived to offer final prayers, though Catherine's own faith had always been more personal than public. The gentle words of comfort and hope filled the room with a sense of sacred purpose, acknowledging that this death was not just an ending, but a completion of a life lived with extraordinary grace and purpose. Dr. Mitchell monitored Catherine's vital signs with professional expertise while maintaining the respectful distance that the moment required. She had attended many deaths throughout her career, but Catherine's peaceful departure felt different, marked by the kind of dignity and love that made death itself seem less frightening and more like a natural completion of a beautiful story. As the last light of day faded from the windows, Catherine's breathing became softer and more spaced apart. William held her hand tightly, feeling the pulse that had beaten beside his own for so many years gradually slowing. He whispered his final words of love, promises to care for their children and gratitude for the extraordinary gift their life together had been. In response, Catherine's fingers squeezed his hand one last time, a final gesture of connection and love that would sustain him through all the dark days ahead. At 8:47 p.m. on May the 2nd, Catherine Elizabeth Middleton drew her final breath surrounded by everyone who loved her most. The monitors fell silent, but the room seemed to fill with something indefinable, a presence that felt like peace itself settling over the cottage. William continued to hold her hand long after Dr. Mitchell had gently confirmed what everyone already knew. The woman who had transformed from a university student into a beloved princess, from a nervous young bride into a confident mother, had completed her final transformation. The immediate aftermath felt suspended in time. No one moved for several minutes, as if motion might somehow disturb the profound stillness that had settled over Catherine. William finally leaned down to kiss her forehead, whispering words that only he and she would ever know. The gesture was so tender, so private, that everyone else in the room looked away, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something sacred and deeply personal. The children were brought in to say their final goodbyes, a moment that required every ounce of strength the adults could muster. George approached his mother's bed with the solemnity of someone much older, touching her face gently and telling her he would always remember her stories. Charlotte climbed onto the bed and curled up next to Catherine, whispering secrets that only daughters share with their mothers. Louis, confused but understanding that something permanent had changed, simply held his mother's hand and asked when she would wake up. Dr. Mitchell handled the necessary medical procedures with extraordinary sensitivity, treating Catherine's body with the same respect she had shown the living woman. The official time of death was recorded, certificates were signed, and the machinery of bureaucracy began to turn. But all of this felt secondary to the human reality of loss that filled every corner of the cottage. The palace was notified immediately, setting in motion protocols that had been planned for months but somehow still felt surreal when actually implemented. The Queen was informed personally by William in a phone call that lasted only a few minutes, but conveyed the weight of a loss that would be felt far beyond the immediate family. Plans that had existed only on paper suddenly became urgent realities requiring immediate attention and delicate handling. The cottage, which had been a sanctuary for Catherine's final months, now became a place of mourning and preparation. The family's protection officers had quietly increased their presence, understanding that the world would soon learn of Catherine's death, and that the cottage would need to be shielded from the inevitable media attention. These men and women, who had guarded Catherine's life, now found themselves protecting her death and her family's grief. Michael and Carol Middleton faced the devastating task of losing their daughter while simultaneously supporting their grandchildren through their first experience with death. Carol, who had been Catherine's anchor throughout her illness, now found her own grief mixed with the practical necessity of caring for 3 children who had just lost their mother. Her strength in these hours would become legendary within the family, a testament to maternal love that transcends even the deepest personal pain. The children were tucked into their beds in their parents' room, reluctant to be separated from their father even for sleep. William sat between their makeshift beds reading the same stories Catherine had read to them, his voice steady despite the tears that fell silently onto the pages. These bedtime rituals, once joyful endings to happy days, had become lifelines connecting the children to normalcy in a world that had suddenly become frightening and uncertain. Pippa and James Middleton had taken over the practical arrangements, coordinating with palace officials while trying to honor Catherine's wishes for privacy and dignity. The funeral would need to be planned, public statements prepared, and the complex logistics of royal mourning protocols implemented. But tonight, all of that felt distant, compared to the immediate reality of a family learning to exist. Without the person who had been their center, the local community had begun to sense that something significant had occurred. Word traveled quickly in small villages, and by late evening people were gathering quietly near the cottage gates. They brought flowers, candles, and handwritten notes, creating an impromptu shrine that would grow exponentially once the news became public. These local residents, who had respected the family's privacy during Catherine's illness, now offered their support in the only way they could. William found himself moving through the cottage like a ghost, touching objects that Catherine had touched, sitting in chairs where she had sat, trying to feel her presence in the familiar surroundings. The home they had shared had become a museum of their life together, every room filled with memories that were now all he had left of their shared future. The garden where they had planned to grow old together stretched beyond the windows, beautiful and heartbreaking in its promise of springs they would not share. Dr. Mitchell had arranged for grief counselors to be available for the children, understanding that their ages would require different approaches to processing their loss. George, already showing signs of the thoughtfulness that would serve him well as a future king, was asking practical questions about what would happen next. Charlotte was displaying anger mixed with sadness, raging against the unfairness of losing her mother so young. Louis simply kept asking when Mummy would come back, unable to grasp the permanence of death. The palace had begun drafting the official announcement that would inform the world of Catherine's death. Every word was being weighed carefully, balancing the public's right to know with the family's need for privacy. The statement would reveal that Catherine had been battling cancer, information that had been kept secret throughout her illness out of respect for her wishes to maintain normalcy for her children. As midnight approached, marking the end of the day Catherine had died, William found himself in their garden, standing among the roses they had planted together. The night air carried the scent of her favorite flowers, and for a moment, he could almost imagine she was still there beside him. Tomorrow would bring the overwhelming task of navigating public grief while protecting his children from the intensity of national mourning. But tonight he simply stood in their garden and remembered the woman who had changed his life completely. The cottage fell into an exhausted quiet, the kind of silence that follows profound upheaval. The children finally slept, protected by family members who would watch over them through this first night without their mother. William remained awake, not ready to face the dreams that might come, not ready to wake up in a world where Catherine was just a memory. The first day of his life as a widower stretched ahead of him, filled with responsibilities he had never wanted, and a strength he wasn't sure he possessed. The morning of May 3rd arrived with the same beautiful spring weather that had marked Catherine's final day, as if nature remained oblivious to the profound change that had occurred overnight. William woke to find himself still wearing the clothes from the previous day, having fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed where Catherine had died. The emptiness of the room hit him like a physical blow, the absence of her presence more powerful than any physical reality. The children stirred slowly, their young minds taking several moments to remember why their world felt different. Louis was the first to ask where Mummy was, and Charlotte gently reminded him of what had happened, her 9-year-old wisdom already adapting to her new role as protector and explainer. George simply lay quietly, his mature understanding of death making him the most acutely aware of what they had all lost. At 10 a.m., the palace released the official statement that would transform private grief into public mourning. The carefully crafted words announced that Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales had died peacefully at Adelaide Cottage after a brave battle with cancer, surrounded by her loving family. The statement requested privacy for the family during this difficult time, while acknowledging the profound loss felt by the nation and the Commonwealth. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News channels interrupted regular programming. Flags were lowered to half-mast across the United Kingdom and Commonwealth nations, and tributes began pouring in from world leaders who had been moved by Catherine's grace and dedication. The cottage, which had been a peaceful refuge, was suddenly surrounded by media trucks and crowds of mourners, forcing the family deeper into their protected sanctuary. William faced his first public duty as a widower when he was required to approve the funeral, arrangements that had been planned during Catherine's illness. Westminster Abbey, where they had been married with such joy and hope 14 years earlier, would now host her funeral service. The symmetry was heartbreaking but somehow fitting, marking the completion of a royal love story that had captured hearts around the world. The children struggled with the reality of their mother's death in different ways. George threw himself into helping with practical arrangements, desperate to feel useful in a situation where children could do very little. Charlotte swung between angry outbursts and periods of silent grief, her emotions too large for her small body to contain. Louis continued to ask when his mother would return, his 6-year-old mind unable to fully process the concept of permanent absence. Catherine's parents faced the devastating task of planning their daughter's funeral while supporting their grandchildren through their first experience with profound loss. The service would need to honor Catherine's role as a princess while celebrating the woman, mother, and daughter she had been. Every decision felt weighted with significance, from the choice of music to the selection of flowers, each detail a final gift to someone who could no longer appreciate such gestures. The outpouring of public grief was extraordinary and deeply moving. Flowers, letters, and tributes covered the gates of Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, and Adelaide Cottage. People traveled from across the country and around the world to leave tokens of their affection for a woman who had touched their lives through her public service and genuine warmth. The sheer volume of public emotion provided some comfort to William, confirmation that Catherine's life had mattered far beyond their private happiness. The Queen made a rare personal statement, describing Catherine as a devoted mother, beloved daughter-in-law, and tireless servant of the people. Her words carried the weight of someone who had experienced profound personal losses while maintaining public dignity, offering both comfort to the nation and guidance to William as he navigated this impossible balance between private grief and public duty. International tributes poured in from leaders who had met Catherine during state visits and royal tours. They spoke of her intelligence, Her genuine interest in their cultures and causes, and her remarkable ability to make everyone feel valued and heard. These testimonials painted a picture of a woman whose influence had extended far beyond ceremonial appearances, someone who had used her platform to create real positive change in the world. The children were shielded from the intense media coverage, but they could sense the magnitude of the world's response to their mother's death. William made the decision to show them some of the tributes from children around the world, helping them understand that their mother had been loved by people they had never met and would continue to inspire others long after her death. Plans for the funeral grew in scope as the government recognized that Catherine's death represented a moment of national mourning comparable to the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. World leaders requested permission to attend. Ordinary citizens applied for tickets to witness the service, and the logistics of managing such an event while maintaining its dignity and meaning became increasingly complex. William found himself relying heavily on the support of his father, now King Charles, who understood both the personal pain of losing a spouse and the public responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned, even in grief. Their relationship, sometimes strained in the past, deepened through shared understanding of loss and duty. Charles's experience with public mourning after Diana's death provided invaluable guidance for navigating this impossible situation. The cottage began to feel like a sanctuary under siege, with family members taking turns managing the practical necessities while protecting the children from the overwhelming attention. Carol Middleton proved to be a pillar of strength, somehow managing her own grief while maintaining routines that gave the children stability. Her presence allowed William to handle the public aspects of mourning, while ensuring the children felt secure and loved. As the funeral date approached, William faced the daunting prospect of speaking publicly about Catherine for the first time since her death. The eulogy he would deliver needed to honor her memory while providing comfort to a grieving nation. He spent hours writing and rewriting, trying to capture in words the essence of a woman whose true self had been so much more complex and beautiful than her public image. The night before the funeral, William sat in their garden one final time before Catherine's body would be moved to Westminster Abbey. The roses she had loved were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the evening air with beauty that felt like her presence. Tomorrow would mark the end of their private mourning and the beginning of a very public goodbye, but tonight he could still feel like her husband rather than a widowed prince facing the sympathy of the world. The children, exhausted by grief and the disruption to their normal lives, finally slept peacefully for the first time since their mother's death. Tomorrow they would need to be brave in front of millions of people to say goodbye to their mother while the entire world watched. But tonight they were simply three children who missed their mummy, protected by family love and the knowledge that Catherine's legacy of kindness and strength would live on in them forever.